Okay. This is my junior historian project, and I'm interviewing my grandfather, Elmer Griffin, on the Great Depression. First of all, I just wanted to ask, what was the Great Depression overall?
Well, the Great Depression was a time that people had lost their jobs, their homes, their farms, and the banks had come to a complete stoppage. The stock market had collapsed, and the whole country was in a very bad way. You have to remember that in the 1920s, right before the Great Depression, there was a time of great prosperity. Almost everybody had a job that wanted one, and the stock market was a new high. People were all investing, so to speak, in the stock market like they do now. But it collapsed in October 29, and things went very bad very quickly. Now, fortunately, over half of the people in those days lived on farms, so they made do, eating the food they raised themselves, and proceeding on the premise of, there was a motto in those days that you used it up, or you handed it down, or you wore it out, whatever you had in the family. If you didn't eat it up, you wore it out, or you handed the clothes down to the kids. So it was a case of just trying to get by. But the people in the cities, they didn't have any farm gardens to fall back on. And the men were roaming the countryside. The trains were full of, we would call them hobos now, but in those days they were trying to find a job someplace. And almost every day someone would come to the door and ask for a handout. These fellows would need something to eat. Now, prices were very cheap. You could get a Coca-Cola for a nickel. A loaf of bread was a nickel. Some quart of milk was a dime. And the grocery men in those days were small operators, and they gave a lot of credit out. A lot of them gave out too much credit. But people tried to help each other. And this was really a tough period. First, we didn't understand what happened. We knew that everything just practically stopped. But we didn't understand it, and we had to feel our way. And it was several years before we worked ourselves out of that. And really we could see that Hitler in Germany was causing a lot of trouble, and there was this arms buildup before the World War II started, which helped the economy a great deal. So that's briefly as a summary of the Great Depression.
How old were you in the Great Depression?
In 1929, when it started, I was 14.
How many?
My father had passed away a few years before that. Lived in a small town with a courthouse, square type county courthouse, about 7,000 or 8,000 people. And, so to get to high school, which I was, I had a pretty 30 every morning, carried papers, and I went into the drugstore and worked from 6:30 to 8. Went back to the drugstore at 4:30 and worked to 6. Things like that. And I had one brother. He was a couple years older than I was.
Where did you live?
This was in a little town in Illinois, Paris, Illinois, very much like Paris, Texas.
Okay. Well, what kind of things did you do for entertainment?
Well, we listened to the radio at our neighbors. We didn't have a radio because they were just being invented. But some of the more wealthy neighbors, we say, had a little money. They had get these radios. The radios had 3 dials on them. You had to tune each dial separately. The speaker was a big horn. Come on, set on the top of it. It looked like a big horn.
What kind of transportation was there?
Well, there were these Model T Fords and old primitive automobiles like that. They weren't very fast, but they would run, and then the Model A Ford came along, which was an improvement.
Do you really remember the crash itself, like when it happened?
I do. It wiped out the savings of so many people, including a very dear friend of mine, and I know that their losses are considerable.
Was Illinois, where you lived, was it like part of the so-called Dust Bowl?
Not in those days. The Dust Bowl itself came a little later in the Depression, in the mid-30s. The period I'm talking about is a little earlier, but the Dust Bowl finally got not as bad, though, in Illinois as it was farther west and south.
Mm-hmm. And how did the election of FDR update?
Well, that was the first fellow I ever voted for, was FDR. And that was something we were all excited about, a New Deal.
That was in 36 that you voted?
That was in 1936, but of course he was elected in 32. The previous president had been Mr. Hoover, who got all the blame for the Depression, rightly or wrongly.
What kind of things did your parents do?
Well, it was just my mother-in-law. They it was a rather quiet time. There was church work and let's see, I was into scouting myself, and my mother worked, so she didn't have much time except to rest up in the evening.
Okay.
You might mention your grandparents on the farm, no?
Yes, and I spent a lot of time out with grandparents on the farm. They were both on each side. There were 2 grandparents, 2 farms. So between one or the other, I was out there a great deal.
That's all. Explain a little more about what FDR did.
Well, FDR was a doer. He believed that with the country practically paralyzed, somebody had to do something, and it was he who had to do it. So he started a lot of programs which really got the country moving again. Now, there was the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps. Young men were entering this to work on, this was a government program, they worked on building parks and all sorts of projects of that kind. And the WPA was established, Works Progress Administration, which gave millions of men a job. It was only, I think, $12 a week, but it was better than nothing a week. And there were other programs, there were educational programs,
FDR,
and
federal education.
federal educational program. And I remember I was going in college, and I graded papers for 35 cents an hour. And
FHA came along later on.
And a Social Security program was started. My own Social Security card is dated 1936. That's about the time it started. The Army was reorganized, and it was practically non-existent. The military forces were set in motion, and these all added together to a real effort to improve things, and they did, by God.